Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our second bi-monthly Ask Me Anything live video series. If you missed the first, The Truth About Asylum Seekers and the So-Called Border Crisis with Senior Staff Attorney Ayadel Gonzalo, you can still see it in the video section on HIAS-PA's Facebook page. I'm Cathryn Miller-Wilson, the Executive Director of HIAS-PA, a nonprofit whose mission is to provide legal and social services to immigrants and refugees in Pennsylvania. Today, our conversation will focus on the family separation crisis. What's happening now? Thanks to everybody who submitted questions already. We're excited for our conversation today. If you haven't already done so, please submit any questions you have during the next half hour in the comment section below. If we don't get to them during this live conversation, we'll answer them in the comments. We'd also love to hear your ideas for future videos. We hope that through this video series, you can ask any questions you have and learn the truth about immigration and refugee resettlement in the United States. Today, we're excited to be speaking with HIAS Pennsylvania Immigrant Youth Initiative Supervising Attorney Elizabeth Yaeger. Liz has been leading HIAS Pennsylvania's Immigrant Youth Initiative since 2014. While her work has primarily focused on youth who enter the United States by themselves, her teams focused on immigrant youth meant that they worked directly with the few separated children that ended up being housed in the greater Philadelphia area this summer. So I'm going to start with a question from me. This coming Saturday marks a year since the current administration enacted its zero tolerance policy. How did that policy lead to the family separation crisis?
So thank you, Kathy, for that question. I think it's a great question. But before we can answer that, I think we have to ask an initial question, which is, what was it that led the administration to initiate the so-called zero tolerance policy in the first place, to make that decision? So first of all, what that's referring to, zero tolerance, was this decision to uniformly criminally prosecute anyone who crossed the U.S. border irregularly, meaning between ports of entry. So just to give a little bit of background, the people who we're talking about when we talk about the family separation crisis are largely asylum seekers from Central America. U.S. law provides that if you have a fear of returning to your home country, you can apply for asylum. And the way that you do that is you have to be here in the United States first. And in fact, asylum law forgives people who cross the border without inspection before they apply for asylum, and even people who enter the U.S. with fake documents, right? These are not things that are seen as such horrible transgressions that they should lead to a denial of your asylum case if you have otherwise a well-founded fear of return and meet the other requirements. So one way, for example, that a person could apply for asylum would be to present themselves at what's called a port of entry. So a port of entry is a place along the US-Mexico border and other borders as well, where there are Customs and Border Protection officers, where, for example, you can show up with your visa and seek entry to the United States. But if you don't have a visa and you want to apply for asylum, you can go to one of these ports of entry and say that you have a fear to return, that you want to apply for asylum. And then US and international law provides that you have to be given an interview to determine whether you have enough of a fear to be allowed to proceed with your case. You're then often, taken into immigration detention, oftentimes indefinitely. So people who are doing this are really kind of throwing themselves at the mercy of the US immigration system out of desperation and need. What we've seen happen in these past couple of years is increasingly Border Patrol agents at these ports of entry telling people that they are not allowed in. Either that there's no space that day to take all the people that want to apply for asylum, or simply that, the US isn't offering asylum anymore, which of course is false and illegal. But, if you can imagine a desperate asylum-seeking mother or father or family being told this, what might they then do? They might then go down the street, find somewhere else to cross the border wherever they can, and they might even then just sort of throw themselves at the mercy of whatever Border Patrol officer they come across and say that they want to apply for asylum. Those are the people that the government was deciding to prosecute for having entered the US unlawfully. So up until that time, this time last year, it was never the policy to initiate criminal proceedings against people for unlawful entry, in 99% of cases. Just like in any other criminal justice system, there's a question of use of resources, what crimes do we prosecute, and how and which do we not. In the immigration context, every single one of those people is also being subject to the civil immigration enforcement system, meaning that the US government is aggressively pursuing their deportation in front of an immigration judge. And so it was always sort of seen as an unnecessary use of resources to also criminally prosecute people. But in 2017, 2018, what the Trump administration wanted to do was find a way, some way to deter people from coming to the US to seek asylum. And so, this is one way that they decided to try to do that. By doing the most sort of shocking and harmful thing that they could think of, which is separating parents from their children in order to punish people, and with the thinking that this would send a message to future asylum seekers to just not try. Of course, that doesn't work, because we know that people who are desperate to seek asylum will do so through whatever means they can to save themselves and their families. Excuse me. But that's sort of the legal justification that the government made, was we're going to decide to prosecute all of these people, and then naturally, as a consequence of those criminal prosecutions, we have to send the parents to jail and take the kids away and send them somewhere else. And so what happens is the children are then put in the care of a different agency called the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And that's kind of how the family separations happened.
Well, thank you. It certainly is enlightening. I guess I just want to clarify for our listeners. So when people are fleeing in the circumstances that you described, including the people that got separated, what are they fleeing from? What kinds of things are they claiming are the problems?
So, with these families in particular, we're talking oftentimes families from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Oftentimes, it's families who are fleeing things like gang violence, violence against women, and sexual violence in particular, the failure and inability of those countries' governments to protect these particularly vulnerable people, including people who've directly experienced harm and had to flee. When I think about asylum seekers from Central America, I often think of a poem that was written by a Somali refugee, which starts out by saying, you don't leave home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And in this poem, the poet talks about how, you don't just leave your home unless you're forced to flee. So the people we see that are fleeing are doing something that, to me, I see as incredibly brave, which is picking up and leaving everything behind because they have to, and they want to save themselves and their kids.
Okay, thank you. So that brings us to, we got a question from a Germantown Friends School student who asked, do you agree with how the Trump administration is dealing with undocumented immigrants? And I'm going to assume that she means with respect to the zero tolerance policy.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure, that's what you mean. No, I do not agree with how the administration is treating undocumented immigrants.
And why not?
Generally, so in general, what we've seen is a tremendous shift in thinking and in policy from a couple of years ago under the previous administration, from sort of a common sense use of resources that pursued immigration enforcement against some people but not others, taking into account, how long people have lived in the US and their family ties and humanitarian concerns like this. And that's shifted towards basically, kind of going after the low-hanging fruit with the goal of deporting as many people as possible, because that's the promise that Trump made before he was elected into office. But, mass deportations of people in our communities are not good for the country, I don't think, because one person's deportation affects not just them, but their family, their work, their loved ones, their community. And that's not a good thing. Talking about immigrants in the US, we need a pathway to citizenship for undocumented people, which is something that we've gotten just kind of very far away from even talking about. And as far as asylum seekers along the border, we need to treat them humanely, which I think is what US law, international law, and a moral imperative requires us to do.
So great. So I think that answers her second question, which is, if not, what do you think could be improved upon? So creating a pathway to citizenship, creating more humane policies, I assume is what you would recommend.
I mean, taking into account the being realistic about the fact of people fleeing their countries and seeking asylum in the United States, that's not something that you can stop by yelling to a TV camera that people should stop coming, or by imposing these incredibly cruel policies like family separation, or like attempting to indefinitely detain families, which is another thing that we've seen this administration trying to do, despite the fact that we have laws on the books that say that it can't be done. And instead, coming up with both realistic and humane ways that let us actually, that let these people actually have their claims heard, have justice, have their day in court.
Right. Have what we lawyers call due process. How do you think that the issue of family separation is affecting Pennsylvania or even Philadelphia specifically?
Sure. So here in the Philadelphia region, we did see some children arriving here locally who had been separated from their parents during last year's crisis. Our agency and my team works directly with unaccompanied children in a shelter here in the area who are in the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement because they are unaccompanied, which typically means a child who entered the U.S. on their own. They weren't in the company of a parent or legal guardian at that time. When these family separations happened, what happened was that these separated children were rendered unaccompanied because of the government's action of removing them from their parents. And so then those children were sent to, any one or any number of these shelters that just happened to exist around the country. And because we happen to have one of those here, we did see about somewhere around 15 children enter our facility. Our staff then was, working with them right away to try to figure out where are their parents? Can we get in touch with them? We're on the phone with in detention facilities and ICE officers for days at a time, trying to locate parents, get in touch with them, put them in touch with their children, figure out what everybody wanted, and do what we could to help make it happen. Yes, aside from that, we've known about a couple of families who have gotten reunited after separation and landed here in the Philadelphia area, settled here where maybe they had relatives already. We were fortunate enough to be able to link a couple of those families with pro bono legal representation for their cases. But I think, even looking bigger picture than, the family separation crisis, there's other ways in which people in the Philadelphia area are, experiencing the effects of current policies and experiencing the family separations that occur as a result of that. So one of those things I'll say is, children in ORR custody generally. So I mentioned
ORR being Office of
Refugee Resettlement. So, we do have the one facility here. There are many across the country. Most of the children in those facilities were not separated from their parents by the government. Most of them are children who arrived in the United States unaccompanied. And it is up to the staff of those facilities and to, the government officials at ORR to ultimately place those children in the least restrictive setting that's appropriate to their unique needs and best interest. That's one sort of like agreed upon principle of child welfare that found its way into the immigration legal system and applies to these kids. So in most cases, that means that a relative is located, the staff and government are looking for a relative that the child might have in the U.S., whether it's their mom or dad or an adult sibling or an aunt or an uncle. And if that person's willing and able to come forward, give their fingerprints, be vetted, show that they're able to care for the child, then they can be approved as what's called a sponsor to care for that child. And the child gets released to the sponsor. Meanwhile, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is still aggressively pursuing that child's deportation in immigration court, but at least the child gets to live in a home with family instead of being institutionalized for the duration of their immigration proceedings. But what we've seen happen in recent years is that those children remain separated from family who they could otherwise be living with, specifically because of the government's decision to make things really difficult for the sponsors or would-be sponsoring relatives. I mean, so one thing is just sort of the general concept of who's going to be willing and comfortable to come forward and claim a child if they have concerns about their own immigration status, because of course, many of the relatives of these children are of course immigrants themselves. But what we saw happen 2 years ago now was that for the very first time, the government issued a memo requiring cooperation between the Office of Refugee Resettlement and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, in order to get those sponsors' information, run their background checks, and then use the information however they wanted to use it. So instead of ORR, who's perfectly capable of doing these tasks themselves, every single sponsor and oftentimes all of their household members have to share all of their information with ICE. And ICE can, and sometimes does, use that information however they choose to, including initiating deportation proceedings against that person. There was a report that came out recently by the Women's Refugee Commission and some other organizations describing this phenomenon. And the title of that report is Children as Bait, which I think pretty accurately captures exactly what's going on here. So we've seen cases of adult relatives here in the Philadelphia area who found out that their, nephew or daughter or whoever had crossed the border by themselves, was in ORR custody. They said, yes, I would like to go sponsor this child. And then that landed them in deportation proceedings themselves. We've seen children who arrive at our shelter who are, sitting there in the shelter for months at a time, hoping to go to an uncle or whoever it is. And then lo and behold, we find out that after that uncle submitted his information, he got picked up and deported. And the effect of all of that is to keep these children separated from their families for longer and longer and longer periods of time. And so children are experiencing kind of prolonged periods of detention, which is, of course, harmful to them.
And just to clarify, so those children whose relatives got picked up when the relatives were trying to sponsor them, then remain in the taxpayer-funded shelters.
Sure, of course.
Right.
Yes, of
okay.
course. Instead of with family who are might be perfectly capable of caring for them. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, the last thing I'll just say before moving on from that is, even outside of the context of ORR and unaccompanied children and kind of recent immigration, is everybody in Philadelphia who's been affected by the deportation of their loved ones and the separation of their families in that way. One of the things that we do here at HIAS on our youth team is we periodically go out to schools where we have the tremendous honor of being able to meet with big groups of students who might be immigrants themselves or might be children of immigrants and who want to learn about their rights. And we give these presentations about immigration law, and then we offer free one-on-one consultations with the children. Every single time we do that, we get approached inevitably by one or more children after the fact who tells us, yes, I lost my mom to deportation. She used to live here with us, but, she got sent back to Brazil, or my father got deported to Indonesia, and now I'm just here living with my older sister and we're on our own. So really, you just see time and time again the ripple effects of harm and trauma that one person's deportation can have on their whole family and their community.
And those children, are they American citizens, those children?
Sure, sometimes,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, and I guess, you've also answered for us, the student that had asked the question asked, what do you do as an immigrant youth initiative supervising attorney? And so I suppose the answer is you give talks, you represent immigrant kids.
Yeah. So we inform, let people, help people to understand their rights, right? Help people to understand what rights they have in the United States, whether they might be entitled to some legal protection under U.S. law, right? So even somebody who's undocumented, they may be undocumented and have no remedy under current law, no way to legalize, but they might have a pathway to actually get legal residency and ultimately U.S. citizenship because they meet these certain requirements under the law. Oftentimes people don't know much, if anything, about that until they meet with a lawyer. So we talk with people, help them understand what rights they might have. People who do have some kind of a legal remedy, we often directly represent them in their case, which means we help them to, file their applications with immigration, defend against deportation. As the supervising attorney of our youth project, I also get to work with wonderful colleagues who are also doing that work, and I get to be involved with helping them to be the best legal advocates that they can be.
Great. Okay. So tell us a little bit more. I want to get back to the family separation that occurred, that began occurring about a year ago. It's a year later. Some children have yet to be reunited with their parents. Is that true?
That is true, yes.
So
yes.
What's happening? Why have they not been reunited with their parents?
So the reason why the reunifications started to happen last summer was because a judge in district court in California ordered that it had to happen. So the ACLU had filed a lawsuit on behalf of a woman, a young mother by the name of Miss L, that then turned into a class action lawsuit representing all parents whose children had been separated them under these circumstances, by ICE and ORR under this policy. In June, the court issued a ruling saying that these certain children, that nationwide class, which was somewhere around 2,000 people, 2,000 children, had to be reunified with their parents. But within that ruling, there was left open some room for certain cases where they actually didn't have to reunify them. If there was something going on where the government determined that it wasn't in the child's best interest to return to their parent because the parent was abusive or somehow in some other way presented a danger to the child. But the language in that court order is is not super strict. It leaves a lot open to interpretation, and it's up to the federal government, to ICE, to determine which parents kind of fall into that category. So in some cases, the children who remain separated from their parents or who continue to be separated are situations where ICE determines, there's some criminal history here, so we can't return this child to their parent. But what's happening in a lot of those cases is that it may be something as minor as an old DUI conviction that the parent has, which granted is, not a great thing, but is certainly not the kind of thing that in the normal world would cause the government to indefinitely remove your children from their care. Really doesn't have an impact or a bearing on the parent's ability to be a parent. So that's one thing. Another is that even in the wake of that ruling, and even now, it was not easy for a lot of those parents to be located because leading up to the policy, there was really, and I can say this with confidence, zero planning or foresight around this concept of eventually reuniting the families, right? It was sort of this thinking or lack of thinking of just, well, the kids will have to go into ORR custody, we'll prosecute the parents and ICE will deal with them, and that's it. So there was no internal tracking system by which children who went into ORR custody were specifically identified in a database, let's say, as having been separated from, this particular parent and where that parent was located. It came out later on that some ORR staff started trying to keep track of such things, and they were ordered by superiors to then delete that database. So
what's
there
the
was
justification for deleting it?
Who knows? Who knows? But I mean, just immense incompetence.
Right.
So there was a report by the Government Accountability Office that came out earlier this year that sort of really detailed all of the shocking details of that. But at the end of the day, it was just administratively an almost impossible task sometimes for the parents, the children to be located and reunified. In a lot of cases, the parents had already been deported by the time the court order came out, or got deported after the fact without maybe fully understanding their rights. And so I gather that locating those parents who might be in the highlands of Guatemala and very rural and remote places was and continues to be a challenge. And it came to light earlier this year also that even more children had been separated than was previously accounted for in that court ruling. So that court order applied to children and parents who were in government custody last June, this time last summer, when this was all, all over the news. And that was around the time that, or that was right after the government had initiated this family separation policy nationwide. But we knew, advocates knew, that actually these things had been happening for a long time before that. And in fact, it was confirmed recently, formally, that as early as July of 2017, so, almost 2 years ago, the government had started to separate. They were piloting this family separation policy in, certain sectors of the border. And so there were certain areas where children were routinely being taken away from their parents. And so the court very recently actually issued an order expanding the class of children to whom this applies, saying not only do you have to reunify this initial group of children from last summer, but you have to reunify all of these children who had been separated previously. In a lot of those cases, by the time that order came out and the government was required to then reunify them, those children had been released from ORR custody and were living with relatives in the United States. So the children weren't even all in one place, under government supervision where they could be located and reunified. But they're, out in the world and have to be tracked down because they're no longer under ORR supervision. The government recently said in a court filing that they expected that to find all of those kids and reunify them with parents, it would take something like 2 years, which again is attributed to the fact that, there was no kind of plan for tracking or identifying early on when this all happened, the fact that these were kids who'd been separated from their parents.
Now, I know there's been some talk that President Obama did some separation when he was president. To your knowledge, was there tracking at that time?
Not that I don't know, but not that I know of. I mean, certainly whatever separations were happening at that time were nowhere near the scale of what has occurred, right? I do think that there's probably always been times that, yes, if there was some if it was clear somehow that the person who claimed to be the child's parent maybe really wasn't and was a trafficker or something like that, they would separate the child from the parent or alleged parent, or if there was some very serious criminal history that led that parent to be prosecuted. But it certainly was not happening anywhere near on the level that Trump instituted. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we're out of time, but I really appreciate you've really given us a lot of food for thought, and I want to make sure that our audience knows that you can, we will post any questions that came up that we didn't get to. We'll post the answers to online on Facebook. So I just want to wrap up by saying that folks should stay tuned. Our next Ask Me Anything is going to be on Thursday, June 6th, when we're going to talk about the effects of the travel ban. And remember another time that we banned refugees by remembering the ship, the St. Louis, which had 400 Jews attempting to escape Nazi Germany aboard it when it was turned away by the United States and returned to Europe. More than half of those on board were captured and killed upon their return. So it's very timely to talk about the consequences of banning refugees. As always, we can learn more on how to support asylum seekers and other immigrants and refugees at our website at www.hiaspa.org. Thank you again.